Hi, everyone. This is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Let's go ahead and bring up the screen share. Okay, let's see if screen share is working. I think it is. And so we'll just maximize the screen. And I can't see myself, but I think you guys can see me. All right, today, Sunday, the 22nd. Yay, Sunday the 22nd. You guys can see the screen all right. I am going to be talking about some brainstorming ideas for community-led hubs. All right, so a little bit of history. Back in the day when Cardano was founded, there were three entities. There was IOHK, that's my company. You had this Emergo company, and then we had this always nebulous Cardano Foundation. Now, IOHK, we had kind of a mandate to dev and do science stuff. Emergo was kind of this commercial company, and their job was to basically go and get people adopt protocol, do VC, these types of things. And the foundation was loosely defined as kind of like community and governance. Now, there was this gentleman named Michael Parsons, who was found by IOHK and Emergo jointly. Ken and I found him, and I knew him from back in the day when I was the CEO of Ethereum. And we said, hey, can you set up this CF thing? And he said, sure. And so originally he set it up in the Isle of Man. That seems like a very odd choice. It's an island off the coast of the UK. And basically at the time, in 2015, 2016, there was some new legislation in the Isle of Man that created kind of a cryptocurrency foundation model. And we were like, oh, okay, yeah, this is exciting. But Parsons, he wasn't a very good operator, and he couldn't get a bank account for that entity. And there was a litany of other little issues with the jurisdiction. It was just simply punching above its weight. So Parsons made the decision to establish the Cardano Foundation in Switzerland, the Swiss jurisdiction. Okay. And there was a pool of capital that had been raised for the project, and we got contracted to build Cardano, and Emergo got its share for the commercialization of the VC effort, and a large donation went to that Swiss foundation via a deed to basically get it set up to worry about a lot of the governance, regulatory, and community components. Okay, well, many of you know the story of Michael Parsons. He went a little cray and a little off the reservation, and people kept leaving the council of the Cardano Foundation until a point where he had absolute power. And then bad things happened, and Parsons had to go. So at that point, an interim board was put in. And that interim board basically consisted of Nathan Kaiser, consisted of Manmeet Singh, Domino Berkey. And they all agreed to come in and basically build a independent new board. And later on, Tamara Hassan and Nico Aquiris, oops, let me move this right here, came on board. Okay, so there's 5 right now. All right. Now, the deed, the intent of this entire structure was to have an organization that represents the will of the community. There's currently a Telegram group, and that Telegram group has, I think, 700 or 800 people in it, and they're talking about a roadmap, a community-led roadmap for the Cardano Foundation. And here's the problem with the CF as it stands right now. It has a lot of money, and it has a lot of execution capacity, and there are certain things that the CF as a singular entity probably could accommodate and do very well. For example, there's this open question of who controls the blueprints of Cardano. And those blueprints are the formal specs. So basically, those are implementation agnostic. So they're not written in Haskell. They're not written in Prolog or Java or JavaScript. They're actually written in math. And basically, it's like blueprints of a house. It gives you an idea of how somebody can go and build their own client, whether that be a Rust client or a JavaScript client or a Haskell client. Now, currently, the repository for those is at IOHK. We have that. And what we've been trying to do is figure out how to hand this over to basically an independent group. And the first step of the process was the CIP process. So Frederick Johnson is doing that right now over at the Cardano Foundation. And it makes a lot of sense to get the blueprints over to the CF. Other things like certain libraries, exchange integration technology, and things that make Cardano interoperable that are implementation agnostic, makes a lot of sense for the Cardano Foundation to do that. But then there's always been this question of community representation. So we have Catalyst and we have the DC funds, and you guys are doing an incredible job participating in that. There's almost 4,000 people playing around with IdeaScale. And all kinds of cool stuff is coming, and the funds keep growing in size. They're going to go from 250K to 500,000 USD worth, and just keep getting larger, and more traffic is going to come there. But there's this idea of community hubs, and one of the things that I always hoped for was that we could find a process to do that. So my idea was that eventually we would have something in Singapore, we'd have something in Japan, we'd have something in Buenos Aires in South America, we'd have something in South Africa, and so forth. And basically, each of these would be given grants from the CF, and they're community-led, and basically they're to localize Cardano and commercialize Cardano and do things that kind of accelerate Cardano's growth in their respective jurisdictions. And these grants would just continue until the CF either runs out of money, or if it has a revenue stream, it would be an indefinite thing. And there would be elections in each of those jurisdictions for each of these community hubs. Now, the great part about that is that there's a lot of questions like, how do we get Cardano in Spanish? How do we get adoption in South America? How do we get adoption in Latin America? How do we get more commercialization in Uganda? How do we get more Asia representation and talk with the big banks and so forth? It's really hard for a single hub or committee at the top to basically figure out and prioritize all of that, because let's say they say Singapore is great. Well, that means they're probably not talking to South Africa. Or they say Japan is great. Well, maybe they're ignoring South America. And you just don't want to disenfranchise people. So it makes a lot of sense to set up a collection of community hubs, have the community run those hubs, and give them the resources that they need to be able to get things done. Now, in terms of how these hubs ought to be run, there's a great gentleman named John Buck, and he talks a lot about sociocracy. And there's also this concept of holocracy. And I think for a community-led organization, that's a really cool and novel way to do things. And Catalyst will very rapidly evolve sometime next year to be able to do elections in a free and fair way for ADA holders in certain jurisdictions to decide on community hubs. So we've started kind of an internal working group to talk around what community hubs would look like. And we actually know John very well. He made a proposal to us, and this might be something that we do some directed research for to basically figure out a governing structure. That's a CF side. I think that there needs to be a community board. There needs to be an industrial steering committee. And there needs to be people worry about the Sci and Tech committee. Okay, so the Industrial Steering Committee would represent the people who build things with Cardano. Community Board would represent the ADA holders, and the Science and Tech Committee represents the science. And then, of course, you need an operators panel, an operators committee. And that would represent the SPO class, the people actually running the protocol and so forth. Okay, and then probably a good idea to have a regulatory outreach group. And they worry about everything like, would ADA be perceived to be a security in certain jurisdictions? Or how do we make staking more tax advantageous and so forth? If you're running a stake pool, how do we make sure you don't inadvertently get captured in some weirdo jurisdiction's regulation? And How do we handle compliance situations with ADA, like AML and KYC and so forth? So I think there's room for a lot of committees. Now, unfortunately, this foundation is a Swiss entity, and as a Swiss entity, the Stiftung structure is very inflexible in its governance. And the council members do take personal liability for serving on the council, and they have a bit more power than a normal governing board has. And so it's probably not the ideal structure. Furthermore, there is some profit that the foundation could pursue, so it might be better to actually eventually migrate the foundation over to a more flexible structure like an AG. Even though it's not tax advantaged, it still can pursue some profit-making activity like certification and accreditation and so forth. Or it actually might be a good idea to move it into a 501c3 structure. And actually, I would be in favor of that because the jurisdiction of Wyoming is so nice, and it would be super cool to actually have a Wyoming not-for-profit. I think it's a much friendlier jurisdiction from a regulatory perspective than the Swiss jurisdiction is. But at the very least, it's probably good to separate governance into these buckets where you have industrial representation, community representation, science and technology representation, operator representation, and regulatory representation. And it's probably good to revisit the jurisdictional choices. I didn't choose Switzerland, Michael Parsons did, and this was because of his familiarity with it, MME Partners' familiarity with it, who was the law firm at the time who represented the foundation. And a lot has changed in the world, and there's a lot of very attractive jurisdictions that have more flexible governance structures. And then the community hub idea, I think we have an opportunity as a community to really innovate and do something amazing in this respect. And that's why we started talking to John Buck and these other guys, because I would love to see Cardano hubs in every major population center and on every major continent. And I would love to see local Cardano community members grant funded to run these hubs. And if they're viable, then you have two funding sources, the DC fund, which is replenishing and renewing, and then obviously the CF Treasury in this respect. And then having a centralized entity does make sense when you're talking about standards, accreditation, you're talking about participation with other bodies that handle cryptocurrencies. For example, IOHK, we've joined the Hyperledger group. And that's very important from a business perspective. We're also members of the W3C, which is important for standards perspective. We're a member also of the DIF, the Digital Identity Foundation. So it is important to have a counterparty that actually can staff people to serve on these committees to influence standards. And I think that there needs to be some form of custodial entity for the blueprints of the system so we can eventually get client diversity. And also custodian of the improvement and change management process, not to control it, but rather to make sure that it's following the rules and, almost like a constitution in a sense is being enforced. So this is where we started, 3 entities. We kind of did our best. We went from the Isle of Man, and then it kind of worked its way to Switzerland. Emergo and IOHK provided all the initial funding through this pool of capital to do a donation deed to the foundation. And foundation's gone through a lot. I like the CEO of the foundation a lot, Fred. I think he's a really bright guy. And what's exciting is his background at PwC is all about checks and balances and governance and ethics and so forth. And I think under his leadership, we can probably, as a community, figure out how to get to something like this. And I think that he also has the ability to build a great and independent board. It is my hope that we can get to that independent board as quickly as we can, and we'll see what happens with that. But the community often asks me about what I think about the foundation and what should they be doing and how do they participate and do things. And I think that the answer is nuanced and complicated, as you guys can see here. And there's a lot of moving pieces, but ultimately this is probably the best way to go. It also would then make it very easy for my organization and Emergo and other organizations to participate in the foundation. As we build things on Cardano, we'd obviously sit on the industrial steering committee, and that'd probably be my commercial people like Jerry and so forth. my chief scientist and CTO, they would obviously be hanging around here on the Sci Tech Committee. My general counsel would probably be doing stuff with the regulatory group. We have a lot of community managers. They'd probably be working with the community board. And obviously, we run stake pools too. So maybe Sam would be at the operating group. And that's just a way that we could participate. And if such buckets existed, they'd be very friction-free and natural in that respect. In terms of the community hubs, that is probably the best way to localize Cardano to each jurisdiction's concerns and get people to adopt things rapidly. There's actually been some good work in the EOS community to attempt to do this, and there's been some good work I've seen throughout the years with Dash and NIM and other cryptocurrencies where they created local franchises. And I think the most important thing is, how do you get good governance and decision making, and how do you do these things at a low operating cost and be able to keep a light footprint, but still be able to get a lot of bang for your buck? And then also, because these things are kind of condoned franchises in the ecosystem, we can coordinate with them on a media capacity and a surrogacy capacity, and they could be a message amplifier and make sure that everything is translated into local languages and so forth. And there's a lot of economic opportunity that can come from these centers. So just some quick thoughts about it. And I'll become more vocal about this as we enter into 2021. As many of you are aware, the original contract, the original scope of Cardano was guesstimated to be 5 years. So we thought about 5 years of deep R&D and implementation work would get us where we needed to go. So that was from 2015 to 2020. All things considered, 91 papers later, 1 million plus lines of code, enormous amounts of progress. Shelley's almost done, and we're turning on Goguen hard fork event by hard fork combinator event. We're making rapid progress, but it's going to take some part of 2021 to be able to complete the original scope of work intended for Cardano. Now, there's been many questions about Cardano 2025. So where do we go for the next 5 years? Well, we kind of have to have the infrastructure in the right settings so that the community can decide to go along with a plan or not. Also, I'd like to go from 3 to many entities to improve the resilience of the project as a whole. And I'd like to make sure that there's a combination for funding for these types of things, and that the CF has this type of structure in line before it can get additional funding, because frankly, it needs to represent the will of the community. It was intended to do that. And if the existing structure can't, it needs to be changed to do that. So we actually hired a dedicated guy. We have more than one. And Mr. J, he's working on that. And we'll be making a big proposal sometime next year after we've concluded Goguen and Shelley and these other concerns. Basically that proposal is going to include a vision for where we think we can take Cardano with the next 5 years of deep R&D. It's going to contain a commercial strategy, and it's going to contain an alliance, a federation of actors who are actually going to get that done, alongside a governance structure of how are they going to work together and increase transparency and accountability and so forth. We have learned an enormous amount of stuff over the last 5 years, and there's been an enormous amount of frustration over the last 5 years. That's why I am fat. That's why I have white hair, all these other things. There are a lot of things I'd do very differently if I had a chance to do things again. And I think for the sake of the ecosystem, it's important that they all get written down. We work with some great outside parties, and we know them, the usual suspects, and we put it into a framework for how to propose. So when people say, what happens after the IOHK contract expires? Well, then we go with many people, and we say, this is where we'd like to take the entire ecosystem, and then you, the user, will go ahead and vote on that and make a decision of whether you think that's a viable strategy and a path forward or not. And even if it isn't, well, then it still at least opens the conversation about where do we go and what do we do. And then obviously there's a negotiation, and the community may decide to go in a different direction. But I remain confident that when you guys see the vision and the strategy and how we want to roll things out, as well as the cost of it, given the scope and scale of things, and the alliance that we can put together, that there's a very high probability the community is going to accept that. But we won't vote on that until the original scope of work is done. So that means smart contracts. That means full decentralization of Cardano. That means we have a functioning governing stack. And of course, that we understand what scalability and interoperability for Cardano look like. And we have demonstrations of those things, as well as some maturing of the software, which is rapidly maturing. And I think that we have all of that well in hand. We have all that well scoped. And frankly, we're going to be the best cryptocurrency in 2021 with the Cardano 2020 plan. The research that we've done is definitely paying dividends. And as we turn things on, people are seeing that. For example, with Ouroboros, we have the first major proof of stake protocol that's not only provably secure, but doesn't require slashing or bonds or punitive measures to operate properly. It's a huge problem with Casper and Ethereum too. We just don't even require that. We have a stable system that continues to grow and continues to execute and so forth. So there's plenary examples of that. And I think that when the marketing really does hit, and Lisa's doing a great job with Ouroboros, and those materials are going to be hitting soon for product marketing, and the campaign marketing hits, the space as a whole is going to be aware of these amazing accomplishments that have occurred with Cardano, and it stops being the best kept secret, and it starts becoming a common truth. And then when we look to Cardano 2025, people ask concisely, what's the vision for that? And the vision is, I'd like to get to 1 billion users. I'd like to have an infrastructure that can sustainably work with 1 billion users, and a commercial path to allow the system to eventually grow to that, which means we have to have a large alliance. We have to have a lot of technological miracles. We have to have a lot of future-proofing of the system. We have to really push scalability and continue to build research alliances and so forth. And of course, we have to really have serious governance conversations, because if we're talking about a system of that scale, you're going to have to govern it at the scale of the internet itself. It's a stretch goal. Will we get there? Well, we'll see. But there's no reason we couldn't. Facebook got to that population within the first 5 years. And if you have the right foundations and infrastructure and the right people in the room, there's definitely a possibility for that. So that's what we're going to present. And the community as a whole can make a decision whether they think the vision is valid, the technical strategy and the scientific strategy is valid. And there's all kinds of things that are going to be in there. For example, we'd like to have client diversity. So we're not just on Haskell, but we'd like to have a Rust and a JavaScript client, and a litany of other things. So there are people whose place and purpose is to put these things down on paper and think about them. And a lot of next year is going to be spent communicating that. I will personally go to Japan after COVID has gone down. I'll start at Hokkaido, and I'll work way all the way down to Okinawa. And we'll do a lot of seminars to discuss with the ADA holders there about the vision and what we've accomplished and where we're going. It's a political campaign, I guess. And I'll go all throughout the world and do the same to try to show where we'd like to go, and also tell people where we've been. So I hope that gives everybody some end-of-the-year clarity on what we're entering into in 2021. There's lots of stuff that's turning on, lots of commercialization events that are happening. My salespeople are chomping at the bit, and we have a lot of unfinished business. We have to take the foundation from where it's at to truly an organization that represents the will of the community and the people who industrialize the organization and so forth. And I'd like to see community hubs start forming. And if you guys have some ideas about community hubs, or would like to lead one, or you think there's a particular location that would be well suited for it, the names I put down are places that I feel have good continental appeal. Do let me know in the comments. And this is something I think we can do as a challenge problem in future DC funds, and perhaps use IdeaScale to discuss the ideal community hub. I think we can build this together, and we're certainly going to bring in some great people to talk about it in the coming months, and we hope that that model can mature. The existence of them will bring millions of people into Cardano and massively accelerate our commercial adoption in many jurisdictions, and always give us great media representation. Okay, so that's all I got to say on this topic. I hope it's helpful for everybody. And I'll, of course, be in touch. Cheers, everyone.